Okay, once again I'll say good evening. It's actually the morning, doesn't matter. We're going to keep moving along here on, I don't know, what is this, the 8th, 9th, 10th video. And at this point we're actually going to start using GD&T. There are still some concepts that sort of are building blocks for GD&T, and we're going to sort of introduce those as they become a little bit more useful. But at this point now we've sort of laid out a framework of GD&T. We have a series of symbols. Those symbols are grouped up in what, five categories of form, orientation, location, profile, and run out. And again, even though you don't understand or know all the full details of each one of those symbols, I want you to sort of get that mental picture of those symbols and the way they are grouped up, because they are used sort of in a group. I've already sort of explained that some of the symbols that are on that table really aren't completely necessary. There are special cases of form. We have special cases of location, and special cases of orientation. But again, those are the active symbols. Over time, I think they're going to slowly disappear. But they are the fundamental symbols, the things that we look for first when we try to evaluate any sort of GD&T requirement. Okay, I think there's a second table on the handouts that I gave you that has a whole string of other symbols, and again, a lot of those are very specialized. We're going to use them in the course of building a GD&T requirement or a GD&T feature control frame. Don't worry about memorizing those at all. There's only a handful of them that are used routinely. But in order to really step off in the GD&T, we do have to grab a handful of those symbols and at least understand what the fundamental concept that they're conveying is. And those symbols relate to something that's called material condition. Okay, so I've said that GD&T was structured and written by people who probably should have handed it over to English majors so that they could pick good terms. Material condition is one of those terms that I think would be better substituted somehow. It doesn't mean what you would think it would mean. It has nothing to do with what the material looks like, what it feels like, whether it's rough or coarse, scaly, oily. Nothing to do with condition as we would understand it. It relates to the amount of material. So in the course of this video and as we go along here, we're going to encounter some of the symbols that relate to material condition. And I want you to always remember that just sort of mentally substitute the term of material condition with the amount of material. Okay, so the material condition symbols are simple, but how we use them really affect significantly the tolerance zone that we're trying to control and trying to interpret. Material condition really gives GD&T one of its fundamental powers, which is to adjust the size of the tolerance zone under different conditions. And one of those conditions is the material condition, how much material there is in a feature. Now, as we go along, you're going to see that this is sort of confusing. There are, as we'll see, there are two types of features that we have to deal with. We have to deal with male features and female features, and we have to deal with a material condition where there is more material or less material. And that can get a little bit confusing. So as we go along, we're going to try to learn how to write out these conditions and make sure that we address the tolerance zone accordingly. Okay, so as for the symbols, not too many of them, certainly not anymore. One of them has fallen out of the standard completely. M and L. M and L in the standard. Actually, they're a circle. I should do that just so they look like the symbol. Are the current standards for material condition, or the current symbols for material condition. In earlier versions of the standard, certainly fairly old now, it's sort of dropped out in the last, I'd say, 15 years. There used to be another symbol that looks like this. And I'll explain what that one is. The only time you'll encounter it is on an old drawing. And the interpretation of it was a little bit problematic, and I think that's one of the reasons they dropped it. And the other reason they dropped it is it really isn't necessary. It's a condition that we can assume unless otherwise specified. And the otherwise specified would be by the use of one of these two symbols. Okay, so the M in a circle is maximum material condition. The L in the circle is least material condition. The S, if you encounter it, stood for regardless of feature size. Okay, so how that turned into an S instead of an R, I don't know. It doesn't matter. Again, it's gone now from the standard. I guess it relates to that. This one is no longer in the standard, and I'll show you how it is sort of assumed along the way. So the two that we're going to deal with here today are maximum material condition modifier and the least material condition modifier. And on older drawings, and certainly in notes and in descriptions of the material condition modifiers, you'll often see them abbreviated as MMC and LMC. So the symbols are used in the feature control frame. You don't see the symbols used much in notes or anything like that. You'll either see it spelled out or abbreviated as MMC and LMC, and I'll probably use those terms myself. Okay, so what are these material conditions and how do we use them in GD&T? First, we have to sort of look at what it means in terms of the amount of material in a feature. So I'm going to use my favorite illustration, which is a block with a hole in it. Okay, very first video I think I told you that, you know, a part like this has a lot of features. It has faces, it has edges, it has corners. In this case it has a cylindrical hole through it. But let's focus on just two of those features and the size of those features. Okay, this is in essence all you need to know about the features so that we can start evaluating the material condition of these features for GD&T. All right, so I've given you two dimensions with an associated bilateral tolerance. And the first thing we're going to do is look at these features and determine what their gender is. Now, the gender is, again, probably not the best term, but it is still the term that we use when we start talking about material condition and GD&T. We have to look at the part and decide whether it is a male feature or a female feature. In other words, is it a feature with material in it or with no material in it? Well, it's pretty obvious here that the block has all the material. So the block of material, 2 inches cubed, is the male feature. The hole is the female feature, and it also has a bilateral tolerance. And from all of that now, knowing the gender and the dimension and the size, we can evaluate the material condition of those features. And we're going to do that by just converting the bilateral tolerances into a limit form. So I'll write those down here. And for the hole, okay, now again, the bilateral limit form, all that should be familiar to you. The conversion from one to the other should also be familiar to you. In this case, in all cases, it's strictly an arithmetic operation. You just have to get the arithmetic right. I'll warn you to be very careful when you do that. It's easy to do these numbers in your head and get an error. I'm as likely as anybody to do it, as I'm doing it on the board here. Normally in a classroom, somebody would shout out, "I've got the number wrong," and very often I would, because I did the numbers in my head. So, in all cases, whenever you're manipulating numbers in the technical realm, you want to check and recheck yourself to make sure you've got the numbers right. Okay. Now, in terms of material condition, this is fairly simple, but it's easy to sort of get tangled up since we have the concept of upper limit, lower limit, and we have the concept of gender and material condition, and we have to sort of tie those all up into one ball. But in essence, it is very simple. We are going to look at each one of these features. I'm going to put a gender here just to remind me, so that I get the order of these things correct. This is where you're going to get tripped up if you don't do something just like I've done, write everything out and get things arranged. And we're going to remember too that we have these symbols. Now again, this doesn't stand for male and female or anything like that. This is maximum material condition, least material condition. I'm going to stick those two symbols in the appropriate location on the limits of each one of these features. Okay, so I'm going to start out with the male feature, which is the size of the block. And I'm going to ask myself, what condition or at what limit does this block have the most material in it, the maximum amount of material? I think it's pretty obvious that when this dimension is at its largest, at 2 inch 10 thousandths, that is the biggest it can be, and that is when the most material would be in it. Now, that has nothing to do with the hole. For right now, we're just talking about the cube as a feature. So, male feature, most material, we're going to put the maximum material condition modifier by that limit. Since we only have two, the rest of it's pretty easy. We know now that if this is the maximum material condition, this is the least material condition. Now, this will become very important GD&T. It's important in other aspects too, when we're trying to control weight of components, that sort of thing. Obviously, a maximum material condition is going to be the time when something weighs the most. And least material condition, obviously the opposite. Okay, so let's go ahead and do the female one now. This just takes a little bit of a flip in logic. We're going to look at this 1 inch diameter, and we're going to ask ourselves at what limit is that feature, that 1 inch bored hole, at what limit is that going to give us the most material in the part? This is a little less obvious, but if you think about it, when the hole is at its smallest, there's going to be the most material in the feature. So we're going to put the maximum material condition on the lower limit, least material condition on the upper limit. Not rocket science, but there are those factors of the material condition, the limits, and the gender of the feature that we have to evaluate. We're going to use these controls here and the associated limits as we go along and build feature control frames, and we're going to allow the tolerance zone that we construct to adjust itself based on whether a feature is at its maximum material condition, at its least material condition, or somewhere in between.